So it's been 10 years since the launch of the iPhone 6, and today we're going to do another comparison to a classic iPhone that launched back in 2014, 10 years later, versus the iPhone 16. So what is up, guys? Nick here, helping you to master your technology, and let's have a fun retro look at the iPhone 16 versus the iPhone 6 over here. You'll see a much thinner body. Let's go ahead and boot them up and see how much longer an iPhone 6 takes to turn on versus an iPhone 16 in 3, 2, go. And if you kind of get a first glance here at the front, we still do have a similar design philosophy, which Apple has carried on all through the decade, which is curved corners, flat display. And you can see that even though the iPhone 6 has a 4.7 inch, that 16 is not too much more to carry on the height. It's definitely a lot thicker and heavier though, which is definitely felt by comparison. But you can see already about 4 seconds slower to turn on. We're at about 5 and 6 seconds now. And I could actually bend inside, and that's about 8 seconds to 10 seconds different to turn on. So 10 years later, 10 seconds slower to turn on, just about, on these two. And this design actually has retained itself all the way up until now with the iPhone SE 3rd generation, which is going to be replaced next year, which shows how iconic this design was at the time. So that's definitely something that Apple decided to keep around for a long time. I wonder how long they're going to keep this kind of like design around, this current iPhone 13, iPhone 12, iPhone 14, 15, 16. They've had this kind of general shape and look since the iPhone 12. The iPhone badging on the back, you'll see, or logo, you'll see iPhone logo right there. They used to have this FCC branding at the bottom as well. And then you would have like this design by Apple in California and some trademarking and stuff down there. It was not very good looking. Over here now we do have ourselves just the Apple logo, and it just definitely doesn't really need to say iPhone. Everybody knows if they see an Apple iPhone, it's an Apple iPhone. And this one actually had pretty distinctive looking antennas on the back. I was never really a fan of this look. As you can see, this was not my favorite look right here. But there's something that's still pretty similar 10 years later on the iPhone 16, and that's that you can see those antenna lines on the side are still kind of visible right there. Now you can see, just kind of looking at the body and shape of these, the iPhone 6 was so much thinner back then than the current phone, but you had a much smaller battery as well. Still rounded corners right there. You'll see the buttons are also larger on the iPhone 16, but weirdly enough, they're actually in a better location on the 16 because they're actually a little bit higher on the iPhone 6. As you can see closely right there, the button placement is higher. So it's actually less ergonomic to press that. It's also the same thing on the other side. So let's go ahead and flip it around, and you'll see that the power button not only larger but lower on the iPhone 16. So the reach to the power button here is actually easier for the iPhone 16 than over here. So, and then if you had an iPhone 6 Plus, then it was even more unergonomic for this phone, but the reach is just a little bit higher here. Now, one thing I thought was a little bit funny is how laughably small the camera is by comparison. Actually, the sensors within inside the housing of this look about the shape of the size of that, maybe even bigger than that. And if you look a little bit closer, the camera lens is actually about the same size as the flash on the iPhone 16, maybe slightly larger, the housing, but it's not much. You can see, look at that flash versus that flash. So even the flashlights now are brighter and better. But look at the shape of the camera and the size versus this. This is one of the biggest upgrades you're going to see. The quality upgrades that come to the camera these days are also unbelievable 10 years later. You probably wouldn't even imagine that you would have had all of this on your camera. The iPhone 16 now is basically a pro enough camera in your pocket. Look at the quality, look at the detail. You even have macro modes now. And I actually used to use a Canon camera a lot of the times, and I would have these lenses, like one that's just a standard wide. I would have like a zoom lens like that, and then I would have like the 24 millimeter right here. This is one of my older cameras. I would have one of the 24 millimeters on there, and I would just switching out these lenses. But now on something like an iPhone, you could just do all of that in one. And while I'm not saying the lens can match that of a DSLR because the actual sensor size is physically not larger, it's still getting quite close to where you might not even need to use a camera anymore. And not only that, they've even caught up to using things like a GoPro with the action mode right here. So you can get GoPro-like smooth video on the iPhone. So even potentially replacing a GoPro. It's just a really great all-in-one package. Another thing that is hugely upgraded over the iPhone 6 after all these years is the front-facing camera. 4K 60, 12 megapixels, which could be up at this point. But this was 1.2 megapixels on the front-facing camera. So definitely a usable, it actually still has a usable image here. Unless you don't zoom in 2024, but it's not really great. You can do video at 1080p 60. Again, that's still usable today, but at the same time, it's not going to be a super high quality lens. It's a 1.2 megapixel, but it does the job for a phone. You'll see even the photos, not amazing, but still usable. I mean, that doesn't look horrible. I mean, look at the detail. I can still make out everything very easily. And I would say that the iPhone 6's camera, while it can't do 4K 60 and all that good stuff, it's still pretty usable. It's a usable video. And I think you could actually start a channel in 2024, make some 1080p video. And if the content was good enough, I don't think anybody would complain about this camera. But it's not great. It's still only 8 megapixel. It's not amazing, so don't expect the best of the best here with the iPhone 6. So 10 years later, when looking at the displays, Apple is going much more edge to edge here, and one of the biggest complaints I used to have was these thick, massive bezels, which they seem to stubbornly stick to for a long time until the introduction of the iPhone 10, which even took 3-4 years after this phone. And still, they still offer, a phone with these bezels today. But overall, they're still both Retina displays, and you could still read things pretty legibly on both. However, they're both 60 hertz. So I think the 16 needs to go to 120 hertz. They need to upgrade this phone already. They've had the same 60 hertz refresh for more than 10 years. So it's time. I mean, look at this. On the general home screens, you cannot really tell the difference. But if you put the iPhone 6 next to a promotion iPhone, you will definitely feel the difference. So just kind of scrolling across the software doesn't feel any different in terms of that area. A little bit laggy there coming up on the control center. And we don't have the latest software anymore for the iPhone 6, but still functional and usable on both. One of the areas that is much more improved here 10 years later from the iPhone 6 is the brightness. So this phone could hit somewhere around 500, 600 nits. This one is like 1,000. So this one is much, much brighter, the iPhone 16. And what I keep thinking about is not that, well, duh, Nick, it's been all these years. What would you expect it to be worse? No. What I'm thinking about is that the buyer who was buying the iPhone 6 all these years ago would pay a similar price. And while this phone was great at the time, you're paying the same money for adjusted for today's prices, around the same money. And the iPhone 16, look what you're getting. So if you're going to a base model iPhone now, if you kind of compare it to where we were 10 years ago, the person who's getting a phone now is making out much better than we did 10 years ago. And that's just the way it goes. That's the advancements of technology. But definitely the 16 is a great base model option these days versus what we had just 10 years ago. So when watching video, you'll see that in the vertical orientation here, both of them are pretty good size, but this one is a little bit bigger. You'll also see that if I turn it sideways here on the iPhone 6, you have a 16:9 aspect ratio, which a lot of content looked pretty good on. This phone was never not wide enough. It was definitely wide enough. And it has a pretty nice little TV-like feel here, just a standard flat screen. Looking at the video here on the iPhone 16, you do have dynamic island. It gets in the way a little bit, but still, look at that quality difference in terms of media experience. OLED display, 6.1. And again, like I say, you were going to pay a similar price point for an iPhone 6 back then versus now. It's like holding a little tablet screen in your hand. Well, this one, not so much. It's probably more the Max, but still, you get what I'm saying. The media experience is just so far and away better 10 years later, and it's a true upgrade. If you're coming from a 6S, an iPhone 7, 8, SE, it's a massive upgrade. So 10 years later with the iPhone 6, the software is so outdated, we can't even download apps at this point. You'll see right here, if I hit 3D Mark, it says right there, requires iOS 15 or later. This is a common theme that happens on this phone now, but I can't use most of what I want to use, and things are really slow to download and slow to update. This phone right here is basically not even to me a smartphone anymore. It's kind of just a regular phone that has a few, internet-based things you can do, but you can't do all the smart stuff you can do like with AI and all the new stuff. It's not here. It's not supported anymore, and I wouldn't expect it to be. But I wouldn't expect that I couldn't even download some apps. Like I can't even download some apps on this phone. And if you had a few apps that weren't updated, some of those also don't work. Like X is now, well, this was Twitter back then. So Twitter over here, it's probably nice to see if you like the old Twitter icon to see that again. But it won't even let me update to X because if I hit update now, and sometimes it takes a second to load stuff, you could see it's dragging to load into the App Store. In order to keep using X, you will need to get the best experience, update your app. X, and you'll see requires iOS 15, so I can't download that either. It's basically unusable for a ton of applications, except for the core stuff. Surprisingly though, Apple TV works. Like I was able to watch some of the current shows on Apple TV Plus on here, so it's kind of funny that you can still watch some of the latest show. Apple's going to make sure you can still use their stuff, even though this phone is really old. You could still stream Apple TV stuff, so that's pretty funny. But overall, that's that. Now over here, and also you would come up from the bottom like you do on the SE, and then your notifications tray up there. Coming over here, the software has changed drastically. You can now do more customization than ever before. You can move apps wherever you want. You have the Apple Intelligence on board now. So if I go over here in the settings, you'll see it right about here. You got to go ahead and turn it on though. Apple Intelligence available for this. So a really, really huge change to iPhone all these years later in terms of the software, and a much, much smarter experience while more customizable. And at the time, you probably would have never guessed you would have been able to customize like you are able to now on the iPhone 16. Okay, so the iPhone 6 had the A8 chipset over here. So, and at the time, it was pretty good. It was an update on the iPhone 5S. And yeah, you can actually still browse the internet, and that's actually still pretty smooth right here. But we had the Apple A8 chipset. Got massively faster as we started to introduce more RAM. This only had 1 gigabyte of RAM. The iPhone 6S was a massive improvement in performance over this phone. And then the 7 was better, and then the 8, and then the 10, and then things just got better and better from there. But this one was still it was a little bit lacking because of the 1 gigabyte of RAM, but the processor was pretty good. So it did pretty good for the time. And the software that it ran at the time was still smoother than a lot of Android phones at that time. So this was a 20 nanometer chipset. That sounds laughable by the sounds of it compared to what we have now in a 3 nanometer chipset. And again, when you compare these phones year over year, you don't really notice it. But when you start looking at it versus what we were at just 10 years ago, it seems huge upgrades in this comparison. This one has 3 nanometer chip. That's 17 nanometers less than this one over here in just 10 years. So they're advancing, I would say, in the chip department faster than we're keeping up in terms of what we need to use that power for. Starting at 128 gigabytes. So the gigabytes on here started at the same amount that was the max on here. So the max gigs you could get on here was 128 gigs. It now starts at that. And it has to, because this can do 4K video. You download and use a lot more apps. You store a lot more stuff on your phone than you ever did back then. Although this one still could reach 128 gig. 128 gig would be like having 1 terabyte on your phone now, back then in 2000, and what was it, 10 years ago, 2014, when this phone came out. It was kind of similar because of the amount of storage you would use. Now is just so much more due to the higher file sizes and stuff like that. Okay, so the iPhone 16 gets great battery life by comparison to the iPhone 6. Although the 6, for the way you would use it, was still enough to make it most of your day back then. Now, even a base 16 Plus has enough battery for most users to make it a whole day. So really great battery life for the 16 series, especially the 14 and 13. This one is definitely better. But compared to 10 years ago with the iPhone 6, what are we looking at here? This was under 2,000 milliamp hours. So you would definitely be draining this. And if you really use this thing heavy, the iPhone 6 would really get really toasty to the touch, very warm in here. So it didn't have the best heat management either. And the iPhone 6S was also better at that as well, better at heat management than the iPhone 6. That phone got a little bit toasty in my experience. It's also the one that was famously known for bending, the larger model specifically. When it comes to the ports, we finally have USB-C, which is something that Android phones have had for years, but look at that. The 3.5 mil headset jack, that was really headphone jack. That was really, really nice to have, and it was in the right location. And one thing I really loved about the iPhone 6 is that it felt like an iPod. Now the iPhone has its own distinct kind of feel to it, but back in these times, the iPhone 6 was like a phone version of the iPod Touch. It's exactly what it felt like. So it was really cool to have that dual iPod, iPhone-like experience. It was really, really fun. And now music on phones is like on every phone. It's nothing serious. It wasn't a big deal. But back then, having your headphones, your little headphones that came in the box with the iPhone, your Apple sticker, your iPod-like iPhone, it was definitely cool and a big deal back then. You'll see right here that we still have the same Torx screws, and you could see that Apple still really carries out their design language. Even all these years later, they still kind of carry it on. They don't really, they're pretty conservative in the way they design. They keep things kind of simple and similar. Not that they need to really radically change, but they definitely have polished and refined. It's really a nice touch. The funny thing, though, is this is still a 2.0 USB, and that's also a 2.0. So they should go 3 or 3.2, I think, on the iPhone 17 models. Unlocking these phones, even on the base model iPhones, you can get the Face ID. You've had that since like iPhone 12 days, even iPhone 11, 10R. So they had Face ID, but unlocking here with the home button is still kind of a nice experience. They still use Touch ID on the iPad Mini 7. They're still using it on MacBooks. So it's not like this doesn't really feel that dated. Honestly, a Touch ID sensor, it actually responds very well. Even though this phone is 10 years old, this has not aged horribly at all. Even the newer ones. You now have emergency SOS. You didn't have anything nowhere near close to that back then. And the colors now on the base models are much more zingy, much nicer than they used to be. You had the dull colors here on the iPhone 6 back in the day, but they didn't really have Pro options back then. So they just had the 6 and the 6 Plus. They didn't have like the 6 Pro and the 6 Pro Plus and Max this and plus that. So back in these times, this was the top option, but this would be a base model these days. So Apple definitely expanded the lineup, but you can see 10 years later, a 16 from a 6. I think we see some real changes here. I hope this video helps you understand that you're getting a lot more than you think. It's only when you start comparing it to some of these other, high-spec Android phones and for cheaper prices that you start to see some of the differences. But I enjoy taking a look at some of these more retro phone comparisons to the newer ones to see more substantial differences and to kind of get a look back. But the iPhone 6 right now, if you're wondering, is it usable? It is actually usable for basic use. But the iPhone 16, 10 years newer, is really, really... You've seen that they've pretty much improved every single area of the phone possible. It's only when you look at the year-over-year comparisons that it doesn't look so big. Thumbs up if you enjoyed this retro comparison. Let me know if you want to see some other ones like this where I compare some of the oldest iPhones in the lineup from years and years ago to some of the newest. I'll catch you on the next one. Nick here. Be sure to be well, and peace.